Sergeant Jae-sung crouched behind a shattered concrete wall, his rifle clutched tightly against his chest. Sweat poured down his forehead and stung his eyes, but he didn't dare move to wipe it away. The acrid smell of smoke and burnt flesh filled his nostrils. In the distance, he could hear the guttural war cries of the Croxans, the savage alien race that humanity was desperately fighting to hold back. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jae-sung's unit, the 501st Infantry Regiment, had been sent to the ruins of what was once a bustling human colony to search for survivors. Intelligence had reported that the Croxans had already moved on from this area. It was supposed to be a quick and easy mission. But it had all gone wrong so fast. The Croxans had been waiting for them, hidden amongst the rubble and debris. They had sprung their ambush with ruthless efficiency, their advanced weapons tearing through the human soldiers like a hot knife through butter. Jae-sung had seen his best friend, Ta-min, take a searing plasma bolt to the face. He had watched helplessly as the man he had known since basic training was reduced to a charred, unrecognizable husk in the blink of an eye. All around him, his comrades were dying, cut down by the relentless Croxan onslaught. Somehow, through sheer luck or the grace of some higher power, Jae-sung was still alive. But he was alone now, the sole survivor of his platoon. He huddled behind his meager cover, his heart pounding in his ears, wondering how long he had before the Croxans found him. He checked his rifle, half a magazine left. Not nearly enough to fight his way out, even if he knew where to go. His radio had been hit in the initial volley, reduced to a useless chunk of sparking plastic and metal. He had no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know that he was still breathing. Jae-sung closed his eyes and tried to control his ragged breathing. This wasn't how he had imagined his end, alone and afraid on some godforsaken rock, 1,000 light years from home. He thought of his family, his mother and father and little sister, and felt a sharp pang of grief in his chest. They would never know what had happened to him out here in the cold depths of space. A sudden noise snapped him back to the present. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching over the rubble. The Croxans were coming. Jae-sung gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles turning white. If this was to be his end, he would meet it fighting, like a true soldier of Earth. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and then pain exploded in his side. He looked down in shock to see a jagged piece of shrapnel protruding from just above his hip, dark blood already soaking his uniform. In the chaos of the ambush, he hadn't even felt the injury. But now, as the adrenaline began to fade, the pain hit him like a freight train. Jae-sung's vision swam, and he fought the urge to vomit. He couldn't pass out. Not now. If he lost consciousness, he was as good as dead. He reached down with a shaking hand and grabbed the shrapnel, gritting his teeth as he pulled it out with a sickening squelch. Blood flowed freely from the wound, and he pressed his hand against it in a futile attempt to stem the tide. The footsteps were getting closer. Through hazy eyes, Jae-sung could see the looming shapes of Croxan soldiers moving through the ruins. They were going to find him. It was only a matter of time. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, and Jae-sung felt his strength fading. His rifle slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground. He couldn't fight anymore. All he could do was sit there and wait for the end. As his consciousness slipped away, Jae-sung's last thought was of the bitter irony that after all he had survived, it would be his own body that betrayed him in the end. Then the blackness took him, and he knew no more. The Croxan patrol moved through the ruins, their reptilian eyes scanning for any signs of life. They were a fearsome sight, each one standing over 7 feet tall and clad in thick, chitinous armor. Their weapons, strange amalgamations of organic and mechanical components, pulsed with an eerie green light. At the head of the patrol was Commander Zorgax, a battle-hardened veteran of countless campaigns against the humans. He had led the ambush against the human soldiers, and now he was determined to hunt down any survivors. As they picked their way through the rubble, one of the Croxans spotted a trail of blood, stark and red against the gray dust. Zorgax motioned for his warriors to follow the trail, a cruel smile playing across his scaly lips. If there was a human still alive, they would soon wish they weren't. The trail led them to a shattered wall, and there, slumped against it, was a human soldier. Zorgax approached cautiously, his weapon at the ready. But as he got closer, he could see that the human was badly wounded, a pool of blood spreading out from a gash in his side. The human's eyes were closed, and he wasn't moving. He seemed more dead than alive. Zorgax reached out with a clawed foot and nudged the human. There was no response. The Croxan commander let out a harsh laugh, a sound like stones grinding together. "Look at this, warriors." He called out to his patrol. "See how weak and fragile these humans are. This one is nearly dead from a little scratch." The other Croxans gathered around, laughing and jeering at the wounded human. They took turns poking and prodding him, mocking his frailty. "I heard humans were supposed to be tough," one Croxan said, giving the soldier a sharp kick. "But this one is as soft as a hatchling." "They think they can stand against the might of the Croxan Empire," another chimed in. "But they break so easily." Through it all, Jae-sung remained motionless, giving no sign that he was aware of the aliens' taunts. But inside, a white-hot rage was growing. These monsters had slaughtered his friends, his brothers in arms. They had laughed and joked as they butchered good men. And now they dared to mock him as he lay dying. He wanted nothing more than to leap up and tear the Croxans apart with his bare hands, but he knew he didn't have the strength. He was too badly hurt, and there were too many of them. If he revealed himself now, they would gun him down in an instant. So he lay there, forcing himself to remain limp and lifeless, even as every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance. He focused on the pain, using it to keep himself conscious, to keep himself from slipping away. Commander Zorgax, meanwhile, was growing bored with this sport. The human was clearly no threat, and there was no glory in tormenting a dying foe. "Leave this carrion for the scavengers," he growled to his warriors. "We have more important matters to attend to." The Croxans moved off, their laughter and jeers fading into the distance. Jae-sung waited until he was sure they were gone before he let out the breath he had been holding. The effort left him dizzy and lightheaded, and he could feel his grasp on consciousness slipping. With a trembling hand, he reached for his belt, fumbling for the emergency beacon. If he could just activate it, maybe there was a chance. His fingers closed around the device, but it was slick with his blood, and he couldn't seem to find the switch. As the darkness closed in around him once more, Jae-sung felt a profound sense of despair. He had survived the ambush and the Croxan's cruelty, but it seemed it had all been for nothing. He was going to die here, alone and forgotten, just another casualty in an endless war. His last thought before the void claimed him was a silent apology to his fallen comrades. "I'm sorry," he whispered as the blackness took him. "I'll see you soon." Time passed. How much Jae-sung couldn't say. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his world reduced to a haze of pain and confused, feverish dreams. Sometimes he imagined he was back home, safe and warm. Other times he was back on the battlefield, fighting alongside his comrades. But always, the cold, hard reality of his situation would come crashing back. The pain in his side was a constant, throbbing reminder of how close he was to death. He had almost given up hope when he heard it, the distant whir of engines, growing louder by the second. At first he thought it was another delusion, a final cruel trick of his failing mind. But as the sound grew clearer, he realized it was real. With a surge of desperate energy, Jae-sung dragged himself out from behind the wall. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. He had to make himself visible, had to let them know he was here. The engines grew louder, and then he saw it, a dropship, it tall emblazoned with the symbol of the United Earth Forces. It was the most beautiful thing Jae-sung had ever seen. The dropship landed nearby, and a team of medics rushed out, their white uniforms stark against the gray rubble. They surrounded Jae-sung, their faces hidden behind respirator masks. "We've got a live one," one of them shouted, kneeling down beside Jae-sung. "Severe lacerations and blood loss, possible internal bleeding. We need to get him stabilized now." Jae-sung felt hands on him, gentle but urgent, and then a sharp sting in his arm. One of the medics had injected him with something, and almost immediately he felt the pain start to recede, replaced by a blessed numbness. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Jae-sung caught a glimpse of his rescuers' patches. They were from a MASH unit, a mobile army surgical hospital. He almost laughed. It seemed fitting, somehow, that he had been saved by a relic from a war centuries past. The journey back to the MASH was a blur, a jumble of bright lights and urgent voices. Jae-sung faded in and out, catching snippets of conversation. Lucky to be alive. Going to need extensive reconstruction. Experimental cybernetics program. That last one stuck in Jae-sung's mind as he finally slipped into a deep, medically induced sleep. Cybernetics. What did that mean? What were they going to do to him? But those were questions for later. For now, all that mattered was that he was alive. He had survived, against all odds. And though he didn't know it yet, his journey was only just beginning. Weeks passed, or maybe months. Time had little meaning in the blurry, drug-filled haze that was Jae-sung's existence now. He drifted in a state between sleep and wakefulness, dimly aware of the doctors and nurses who came and went, checking his vitals, changing his dressings. Sometimes he heard them talking about him, their voices hushed and filled with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Most extensive cybernetic reconstruction I've ever seen. Lucky the General's new program needs test subjects. No way he should have survived. It's a miracle. Jae-sung didn't feel like a miracle. He felt broken, torn apart, and put back together like some kind of machine. And in a way, he supposed that's what he was now. As the fog of medication began to lift, Jae-sung started to piece together what had happened to him. The medics who had found him, it turned out, hadn't just saved his life. They had volunteered him for a radical new medical procedure, one that blurred the lines between man and machine. Jae-sung's broken body had been rebuilt with advanced cybernetics, his shattered bones replaced with unbreakable alloys, his torn flesh interwoven with synthetic fibers. He was faster now, stronger, his senses sharper than any normal human's. But the transformation had come at a cost. As Jae-sung lay in his hospital bed, staring at his new metal and polymer hands, he couldn't help but wonder, was he still human? Or had he become something else entirely? He supposed only time would tell. For now, all he could do was focus on his recovery, on learning to use his new body. He had been given a second chance, a new lease on life. And he knew exactly what he was going to do with it. The Croxans had taken everything from him, his friends, his squad mates, his very humanity. Now he was going to make them pay. Recovery was a slow and painful process for Jae-sung. Every day was a struggle, a battle against his own body as he learned to control his new cybernetic enhancements. It was like learning to walk all over again, each step a triumph of will over the unfamiliar machinery that was now a part of him. But Jae-sung was nothing if not determined. He pushed himself harder than he ever had before, driven by a burning desire for revenge that consumed his every waking thought. The doctors and nurses marveled at his progress, at the speed with which he adapted to his new body. As the weeks turned into months, Jae-sung grew stronger, faster, more adept with his cybernetic implants. He spent hours in the training simulators, honing his combat skills, learning to use his enhanced strength and speed to his advantage. His fellow patients, other soldiers who had been wounded in the war against the Croxans, looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. They whispered stories about him when they thought he couldn't hear, stories about the man who had come back from the dead, the soldier who was more machine than human. Jae-sung ignored the whispers, the sidelong glances. He focused solely on his training, on preparing himself for the moment when he would face the Croxans again. That moment came sooner than he expected. One day, as he was in the midst of a particularly grueling simulation, an alarm blared throughout the facility. Jae-sung emerged from the simulator to find the hospital in chaos, doctors and nurses running back and forth in a panic. He grabbed one of the doctors by the arm as he rushed past. "What's going on?" Jae-sung demanded, his voice a harsh mechanical rasp. The doctor looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "It's the Croxons," he said. "They're attacking the colony." In that moment, Jae-sung felt a strange sense of calm descend over him. This was it. This was what he had been training for. Without another word, he headed for the armory, his steps sure and purposeful. He suited up in his combat gear, marveling at how easily his new body slipped into the powered armor. It felt like a second skin, an extension of his own being. As he checked his weapons, a high-powered plasma rifle, a pair of energy blades, Jae-sung caught sight of his reflection in a polished metal surface. For a moment, he barely recognized himself. His face was a patchwork of scar tissue and metal plating, his eyes glowing with an eerie blue light. He looked like a monster. But right now, a monster was exactly what the colony needed. Jae-sung made his way to the front lines, joining the fray just as the Croxon forces were beginning to overwhelm the colony's defenses. He charged into the thick of the battle, his plasma rifle spitting deadly bolts of energy. The Croxons fell before him like wheat before a scythe. He was a whirlwind of destruction, his enhanced speed and strength, making him more than a match for the alien warriors. The human soldiers rallied around him, their morale soaring at the sight of this unstoppable cyborg warrior. But even Jae-sung's incredible new abilities had their limits. As the battle wore on, he found himself being pushed back, the sheer number of Croxons threatening to overwhelm him. It was then that he saw him. The Croxon commander who had led the ambush on his squad all those months ago. The alien was barking orders to his troops, his eyes gleaming with cruel delight at the carnage unfolding before him. A red mist descended over Jae-sung's vision. This was the monster who had taken everything from him, who had laughed as his friends died. This was the one he had vowed to destroy. With a roar of pure rage, Jae-sung launched himself at the Croxon commander, his energy blades flashing. The alien barely had time to raise his weapon before Jae-sung was on him, a whirlwind of slashing blades and savage fury. The battle that followed was brief but brutal. The Croxon commander was a skilled warrior, but he was no match for Jae-sung's cybernetically enhanced strength and speed. In a matter of moments, it was over. As the Croxon's lifeless body slumped to the ground, Jae-sung felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had avenged his fallen comrades, had made the Croxons pay for what they had done. But as he looked out over the battlefield, at the scores of human and Croxon dead, he knew that his mission was far from over. This was only the beginning. The Croxons had started this war, and Jae-sung would make sure that he was the one to finish it. In the aftermath of the battle, Jae-sung was hailed as a hero. The soldiers who had fought alongside him spoke of his bravery, his relentless determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of his stand against the Croxons spread like wildfire, becoming a symbol of hope for the beleaguered human forces. But Jae-sung took no joy in the accolades. His mind was focused solely on the task ahead, finding a way to end this war once and for all. In the weeks that followed, Jae-sung threw himself into his new role as a soldier once again. He joined a special task force, a unit composed entirely of cyborg soldiers like himself. Together, they took on the most dangerous missions, striking deep into Croxon territory to disrupt their operations and gather vital intelligence. Jae-sung quickly proved himself to be one of the most effective members of the team. His unique blend of human intuition and cybernetic enhancements made him an invaluable asset on the battlefield. He could think like a human but fight like a machine, adapting to any situation with lightning speed. But even as he racked up victory after victory, Jae-sung couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface. The Croxons seemed to have an endless supply of soldiers and resources, and for every base they destroyed, two more seemed to spring up in its place. It was during one of these missions that Jae-sung and his team made a startling discovery. They had been sent to infiltrate a Croxan command post to gather any information they could about the aliens' plans. What they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The command post was abuzz with activity, Croxan officers rushing back and forth with an air of urgency. Jae-sung and his team managed to hack into their communication network, and what they heard chilled them to the bone. The Croxans were planning a massive offensive, a coordinated attack on multiple human colonies simultaneously. The scale of the assault was staggering. If it succeeded, it would cripple the human war effort, perhaps even lead to their ultimate defeat. Jae-sung knew they had to act fast. They couldn't let this happen, couldn't let the Croxans win. As they made their way out of the command post, Jae-sung's mind was racing. They had to find a way to stop this attack, to turn the tables on the Croxans. But how? It was then that he remembered something, a half-forgotten conversation he had overheard during his time in the hospital. The doctors had been talking about a new weapon, something that could potentially change the course of the war. Jae-sung hadn't paid much attention at the time, too focused on his own recovery. But now, the memory came rushing back to him with startling clarity. The weapon was a prototype, a fusion of human and Croxan technology that had been reverse-engineered from captured alien equipment. It was said to have the power to destroy an entire Croxan fleet, to turn the tide of the war in humanity's favor. But there was a catch. The weapon was still in development, housed in a secret research facility on a remote planet. And the Croxans, it seemed, had got wind of its existence. The command post had been abuzz with talk of a planned raid on the facility, an attempt to seize the weapon for themselves. Jae-sung knew what he had to do. They had to get to that weapon first, had to secure it before the Croxans could get their claws on it. It would be a dangerous mission, perhaps the most dangerous they had ever undertaken. But Jae-sung was ready. He had been rebuilt for this, had been given a second chance for this very purpose. As he briefed his team on the plan, Jae-sung could see the determination in their eyes, the unwavering resolve. They were all in this together, human and cyborg alike, united in their fight against the Croxan menace. They set out immediately, racing against time, and the Croxan forces that were no doubt already on their way to the research facility. It was a desperate gamble, but it was one they had to take. The fate of humanity hung in the balance. As their ship streaked through the stars, Jae-sung felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. This was his destiny, his chance to make a real difference in this war. He just hoped they would make it in time. The journey to the research facility was fraught with danger. The Croxans seemed to be everywhere, their ships patrolling the space lanes, their ground forces on high alert. Jae-sung and his team had to use every trick in their book to avoid detection, slipping past enemy lines like ghosts in the night. But even with all their skill and cunning, they couldn't avoid every confrontation. There were skirmishes, brief but brutal, as they fought their way towards their goal. Each battle left them a little more battered, a little more worn, but they pressed on with grim determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the planet where the research facility was located. They set down in a remote area, far from any Croxan outposts, and began their approach on foot. The facility was well guarded, ringed with high walls, and bristling with defensive turrets. But Jae-sung and his team were prepared. They had studied the layout, had planned their infiltration down to the last detail. With silent precision, they breached the perimeter, dispatching the guards with quick, efficient strikes. They moved through the facility like shadows, their enhanced senses alert for any sign of trouble. It was Jae-sung who found the prototype weapon first. It was housed in a secure lab at the heart of the facility, guarded by the most advanced security systems the humans had ever devised. But for Jae-sung, with his cybernetic enhancements, it was almost child's play to bypass them. As he laid eyes on the weapon for the first time, Jae-sung couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a sleek, deadly-looking device that thrummed with barely contained power. But there was no time to admire their prize. No sooner had they secured the weapon than the alarms began to blare. The Croxans had arrived. Jae Sung and his team sprang into action, preparing to defend their position. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had no choice. They couldn't let the Croxans take the weapon. The battle that followed was the stuff of legends. Jae Sung and his cyborg comrades fought with a ferocity that stunned even the Croxans, their enhanced bodies allowing them to shrug off wounds that would have felled a normal human. They held the line against wave after wave of enemy soldiers, buying time for the facility's personnel to evacuate. But even their superhuman endurance had its limits. One by one, Jae Sung's teammates fell, until only he was left, standing alone against the Croxan horde. It was then, in that moment of desperation, that Jae Sung made his decision. He couldn't let the Croxans have the weapon, couldn't let all their sacrifices be in vain. With a final defiant roar, he activated the prototype weapon, unleashing its devastating power against the Croxan forces. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The Croxan soldiers were vaporized where they stood, their ships blasted out of the sky like toys. The very ground shook with the force of the weapon's might, the air crackling with energy. And at the epicenter of it all stood Jae Sung, his cybernetic body channeling the awesome power, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. When it was over, the research facility was in ruins, reduced to smoldering rubble by the weapon's fury. But the Croxans were gone, their forces shattered beyond repair. Jae Sung stood amidst the destruction, his body battered and broken, but his spirit unbroken. He had done it. He had turned the tide of the war, had given humanity a fighting chance. But as he looked out over the ruins, Jae Sung knew that this was only the beginning. The weapon was powerful, yes, but it was only one tool in what would be a long and bloody struggle. The Croxans would be back, and they would be seeking revenge. The war was far from over. But for now, in this moment of triumph, Jae Sung allowed himself a small smile. He had made a difference. He had honored the memory of his fallen comrades. And he would keep fighting, keep pushing forward, until the Croxan threat was nothing more than a bitter memory. This was his mission, his purpose, and he would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The news of Jae Sung's victory spread like wildfire across the human colonies. The footage of the prototype weapon in action, of the Croxan forces being wiped out in an instant, became a symbol of hope for a beleaguered humanity. Jae Sung himself became a living legend, a hero whose name was spoken with awe and reverence. The story of his stand against the Croxans, of his sacrifice and determination, inspired countless others to take up arms in defense of their species. But for Jae Sung, there was no time to bask in the glory. He knew that the Croxans would not take this defeat lightly. They would be coming back, and in greater numbers than ever before. The human military wasted no time in capitalizing on Jae Sung's victory. The prototype weapon was quickly put into mass production, and a new strategy was devised to take the fight to the Croxans. Jae Sung found himself at the forefront of this new offensive. His unique abilities and experience made him invaluable in the planning and execution of key missions. He led strike teams deep into Croxan territory, hitting the aliens where they were most vulnerable. Each victory brought humanity one step closer to turning the tide of the war. But each victory also came at a cost. Jae Sung lost many good soldiers, many friends, in the battles that followed. Each death weighed heavily on him, a reminder of the high price of freedom. But he pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to see the Croxans defeated once and for all. It all came to a head in one final decisive battle. The Croxans, in a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, had massed their forces for an all-out assault on the heart of human space. If they succeeded, it would be the end of everything. Jae Sung and his team were the last line of defense. They took up position on a small rocky moon, the only thing standing between the Croxan fleet and their target. It was a battle unlike any Jae Sung had ever experienced. The Croxans came at them with everything they had, a seemingly endless tide of ships and soldiers. The sky above them was filled with the flashes of energy weapons and the explosions of dying ships. Jae-sung and his team fought with everything they had, using every weapon and tactic at their disposal. They pushed their enhanced bodies to the limit, fighting through fatigue and injury, driven by pure, unyielding willpower. In the end, it came down to Jae-sung and the Croxan leader, a massive, scared creature that radiated malevolence. They faced each other on the battlefield, amidst the wreckage of ships and the bodies of the fallen. It was a duel that would go down in legend. Jae-sung, the cyborg soldier, the hero of humanity, against the embodiment of the Croxan threat. They clashed in a flurry of blades and blaster fire, each seeking to end the other. In the end, it was Jae-sung who emerged victorious. With a final, desperate strike, he plunged his energy blade into the Croxan leader's heart, ending the creature's reign of terror once and for all. With the death of their leader, the Croxan forces fell into disarray. They fled the battlefield, scattering to the winds. The human fleet pursued them, hunting them down across the galaxy. It was a victory that would echo through the ages. Humanity had prevailed against impossible odds, had beaten back the darkness that threatened to engulf them. And at the center of it all was Jae-sung, the soldier who had started this journey broken and near death, who had been reforged into something new and powerful. The hero who had led humanity to triumph. As he stood there on the battlefield, surrounded by the cheers of his fellow soldiers, Jae-sung felt a sense of peace wash over him. It had been a long and painful journey, but it had been worth it. He knew that there would be other threats in the future, other challenges to face, but he also knew that humanity would face them together, united and strong. And he would be there, ready to lead the charge once again. For he was Sergeant Jae-sung, the soldier who had become a legend. He was the shield and sword of humanity, and he would never rest until his people were safe. In the aftermath of that final, decisive battle, a new era dawned for humanity. The Croxan threat had been vanquished, their forces scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy. For the first time in generations, there was peace. But it was a peace that had been hard-won, paid for with the blood and sacrifice of countless brave soldiers. And none had given more than Sergeant Jae-sung. The war had changed him, in ways both physical and mental. His body was a testament to the struggles he had endured, a patchwork of flesh and metal, scars and circuits. But it was his mind, his spirit, that had been transformed the most. He had seen the very worst that the universe had to offer, had stared into the abyss of despair and destruction. But he had also seen the best of humanity, the indomitable will and courage that had carried them through their darkest hour. In the years that followed, Jae-sung became a symbol of that courage. He was a hero to the people, a shining example of what humanity could achieve when they stood together. But for Jae-sung, the greatest reward was the knowledge that he had made a difference, that because of him, because of his sacrifices and his determination, countless lives had been saved, families had been reunited, children had grown up in a galaxy free from the shadow of the Croxan threat. He retired from active duty, content in the knowledge that a new generation of soldiers stood ready to take up the mantle of humanity's defense. He settled down on a quiet, peaceful world, far from the battles and the bloodshed. But even in retirement, Jae-sung never forgot his duty. He became a teacher, a mentor to the next generation of soldiers. He shared his experiences, his knowledge, his wisdom, shaping the minds and hearts of those who would follow in his footsteps. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the stars shone bright in the sky, he would look up and remember. He would remember the friends he had lost, the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made. He would remember the day that he, a broken, dying soldier, had been reborn as something new and powerful. The day he had become more than just a man. He had become a symbol, a beacon of hope in a galaxy consumed by darkness. And he knew that as long as that hope lived on, as long as there were those willing to fight for what was right, humanity would never fall. For in the end, that was what it meant to be human. To stand against impossible odds, to face the darkness and the despair and the destruction, and to say no, to stand tall and proud and declare to the universe that we will not go quietly into the night, that we will not vanish without a fight. That was the legacy of Sergeant Jae-sung, a legacy of courage, of sacrifice, of unyielding determination in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a legacy that would endure long after he was gone, inspiring generations yet to come. A reminder that even in our darkest hours, there is always hope. And so, as Jae-sung sat in his quiet home, surrounded by the mementos of a life spent in service to others, he smiled. He had done his part, had given everything he had to give. And he knew that somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the galaxy, his story was being told. The story of the soldier who had become a legend, who had led humanity to victory against the greatest threat they had ever known. It was a story that would never be forgotten, a story that would echo through the ages. The story of Sergeant Jae-sung, the hero of humanity. The end. Years turned into decades and decades into centuries. The galaxy moved on, as it always does, the horrors and triumphs of the past fading into legend and myth. But there was one story that endured, one name that was never forgotten. Sergeant Jae-sung. His tale was told and retold, passed down from generation to generation. In the grand halls of the Galactic Senate, in the humble homes of farmers and workers, in the training camps of the military, his name was spoken with reverence and awe. For he had become more than just a man, more than just a soldier. He had become an ideal, a symbol of what humanity could be at its very best. In the centuries that followed, humanity faced many more challenges. There were wars and conflicts, disasters and triumphs. But through it all, the spirit of Sergeant Jae-sung lived on. Whenever a soldier stood alone against impossible odds, whenever a leader faced a difficult decision, whenever a person struggled against adversity, they would remember his story. They would draw strength from his courage, find inspiration in his sacrifice. And bit by bit, day by day, humanity began to change. They became stronger, wiser, more united. They spread out across the stars, not as conquerors, but as explorers and diplomats. They formed alliances with other races, learning from their differences and finding common ground. In time, the old ways of war and conflict began to fade. The lessons of the past, bought with so much blood and suffering, had finally been learned. A new era of peace and cooperation dawned, a golden age for all the peoples of the galaxy. And through it all, the memory of Sergeant Jae-sung endured. His story became a part of humanity's cultural heritage, a touchstone that connected them to their past and guided them towards their future. In the great cities that spanned the stars, monuments were erected in his honor, schools and hospitals bore his name. But perhaps his greatest legacy was in the hearts and minds of the people, for he had shown them the way, had proven that even in the darkest of times, hope could prevail. Generations came and went, each one standing on the shoulders of those who had come before. And with each passing century, humanity grew and evolved, reaching heights that once would have seemed impossible. They became the guardians of peace, the champions of justice, the explorers of the unknown. They stood as a shining example to all the races of the galaxy, proof of what could be achieved when different peoples worked together in harmony. And always, always, the story of Sergeant Jae-sung was there, a constant reminder of the sacrifices that had made it all possible. Until one day, 1,000 years after the Great War that had nearly destroyed them, humanity made a discovery that would change everything. In a distant corner of the galaxy, on a small, unremarkable planet, they found something incredible. A tomb, ancient and forgotten, bearing a single name: Sergeant Jae-sung. The news spread like wildfire, and people came from all across the galaxy to pay their respects. They stood in silence before the simple marker, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. For some, he was a historical figure, a great hero from a bygone age. For others, he was a personal inspiration, a guide and mentor who had shaped their lives in ways they could scarcely imagine. But for all of them, he was a reminder of the power of the human spirit, of the courage and determination that had carried them through their darkest hours. And as they stood there, beneath the alien stars, they knew that his legacy would live on. That as long as there were those who remembered his story, as long as there were those who believed in the ideals he had fought for, humanity would never fall. For he had shown them the way, had given them the greatest gift of all, hope. And in the end, that was all that mattered.